When we think about the Mi'kmaq treaties, one of the things people need to be aware of is the fact that the signing of our treaties by our ancestors is actually an act of sovereignty of our people, sovereignty of our nation. Because those treaties are signed on a nation basis with other nations. And they are collaboration with our sister nations and our brother nations who are the other members of the Wabanaki Confederacy, including the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, also known as the Wolastoq, and the Penobscot. And I think it's important for people to realize that the treaties, in effect, were the way in which our ancestors protected our treaty rights. And when we say treaty rights, what that really means is they protected a way of life for us. They protected and recognized that we were a nation distinct from the newcomers to our lands. And they had the foresight to realize they had to take measures to protect our way of life. This included not only what we seem to become familiar with now is, you have a treaty right. You have a treaty right to hunt. You have a treaty right to fish, maybe to collect wood, medicines, so forth. And that's significant. I mean, it's been years and years and years of struggle by our leaders to get those recognized. And of course, we have the various court decisions that have finally said, yes, these treaty rights do exist. They are legal, and they have to be acknowledged by Canada. But I think one of the things that is often overlooked and not discussed enough is the idea that the treaty rights, the treaties themselves also protected our lands. And so when you look at the text of the treaties, you will see language in there in the treaties with regards to lawful settlements. And you also realize, although it hasn't been litigated, you also realize that, our leaders were saying, these are our lands. We agree to share our lands with you. But you cannot come into our lands and take our lands without consent. And one of the main ways that we realize that this has been enshrined and there was an effort by our leaders in the 1700s to protect this is not only in the treaties themselves, but also when you look at the negotiations that occurred between Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy and Penobscot and Maliseet leaders with the English and with the British. You'll often see dialogue that's occurring where the leadership, the indigenous leadership, is again questioning the English and the British about, where are you going to settle? And so we'll look at the negotiations, the written records around the negotiations of the 1725 and 1726 treaties. And at that time, the negotiators come right out and ask the English, what do you mean by lawful settlements? And of course, the English response is, we will not settle in any lands where we are not already settled without your consent. And of course, that consent was never granted, but the lands continued to be taken. This is, of course, one of the big reasons why we see so much concern over in the Halifax area when Halifax is established in 1749, and then you see the Mi'kmaq, coming in and raiding and up in arms over this, because for our leadership, again, they're saying, why are you settling on lands that we agreed through our treaties that you would never do without our consent? And so for our people, this was, our leaders said, this is, total opposite of what we agreed to do in the treaties. So I think it's important for people to realize our treaty rights are not only about the things we can do, but it's also about the protection of our lands. So when we're thinking about our treaties, our Mi'kmaq treaties, also known as the covenant chain of treaties, it's important for people to know why they were signed. So our treaties began to be signed and negotiated beginning in 1725 in Boston, Massachusetts, and ended in 1779 with a treaty being signed primarily with the leadership from the Miramichi area. And so during that time period, we have numerous treaties signed at various times, but they're all dictated by circumstances that are happened historically and geographically throughout Mi'kma'ki and into Maine and in Maliseet territory and Passamaquoddy territory. And it's so these different events as they're unfolding are dictating to our leadership that we have to reckon and come to some type of agreement with the British on how we're going to exist in lands, in Indigenous lands. And so when we signed the 1725-26 treaty, a lot of precursor to that was settlement coming up New England, and the different wars that were occurring as Indigenous people started pushing back against their lands being taken. But of course this region was occupied by both the British and the French, who were vying for our lands, Indigenous lands, both of them who had no title to our lands. And so because of our different relationships with them, we had to, our leaders had to figure out, how are we going to come to an agreement that will protect our people for generations and generations and generations. And that is why at various times we entered into the treaties. And of course we thought we would have agreement on different occurrences, and then we may see conflict in an area where we may see, and most times it was because of unlawful settlement. So that again would cause us to say, hold on, our leaders to say, hold on, we're not allowing you to take these lands, and there would be conflict. And you have to remember at the time, in the 1700s, the Mi'kmaq were a strong military force. We had the ability in war and in combat to protect our people and to protect our lands, and that's what our people did. And so it's those types of events that led to the various treaties being signed over and over and over again, and recommitting to peace and friendship that was committed to beginning in 1725-26. When you're thinking about the different treaties that exist, many people will look to the written text of the treaties, and the treaties were written in English. Of course, our people, our leaders, did not read English or write English. They had to rely on translators at the time to explain to them what was the terms of the treaty and whether we were in agreement with that. And of course, there's always concepts that are lost in translation. So in many instances, you may have a treaty that may not reflect in Mi'kmaq, in our Mi'kmaq ideology and language, the exact terms we were seeking. So it's important for people to realize that how our people, how the Mi'kmaq approached treaties is more than what's in that written document. It's more than the written word. And so in order to find out what the intention of our leaders were in entering to them treaties, you have to look at what was happening historically. What were we doing? So you have to look at the meetings that were occurring. Who was interacting with who? What leaders were visiting who? What were they talking about at the time? It's those types of things that begin to tell us what is the intention of the Mi'kmaq entering into these treaties. And that issue itself, that our rights are more than what's on that written paper, has been recognized in law. In the Marshall decision in 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada recognized that, it's the intention of the leaders that we have to start to understand. So when they talk about a truck house in the treaty, what was the intention there? Why did they want a truck house? Is the treaty right just the truck house? No. The treaty right is more than the truck house. The treaty right is the intention for the Indigenous leaders to protect the rights to trade and to facilitate that. Because you have to look at the backdrop. What was our world about at the time? Our world was about trade. And so they were trying to protect the trade right. And so the Supreme Court has already said, in order to understand the full treaty right, you have to look at the cultural context. So it's always important for people to remember that. If someone ever says, well, that's not written in a treaty, well, it may not be written in the treaty, but it may be contained in historical documents that show the intentions of the leaders and what they were trying to gain through the peace and friendship agreement with the Crown. One of the issues that's often been maybe misinterpreted and misunderstood with regards to the treaties is the idea that how they were signed and whether they were signed by all of the leaders of the Mi'kmaq Nation or by one or two. And how does this affect us as a nation? Or are we just individual communities with no collective? And so when you look at how the treaties were signed, we do know that we had what we would call delegated authority. So our leadership would come together and they would delegate certain leaders to go and meet with the English and the British on behalf of everyone. So that shows and demonstrates clearly the collective unity of the Mi'kmaq Nation, along with the other nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy. We did the same thing. We sat down in councils with them, our leaders did, and we collectively thought about how are we going to approach the English. And although some of the treaties are entered into at different times by individual communities, so for example, we know that in 1749, only a few leaders initially ratify the 1725-26 treaty in 1749. And they are from what we would call today the New Brunswick area. So people would say, well, why didn't the other Mi'kmaq tribes and Mi'kmaq leaderships at that time come in and ratify the treaty? Well, 1749 is the establishment of Halifax. So it's very clear why leadership closer to Halifax area are not signing the treaty. And perhaps there was a miscommunication. We can never quite be sure, but there's evidence there, absolutely historically, of why we wouldn't be signing in on 1749. But nonetheless, just because a few leaders signed on 1749 did not mean we did not act as a collective nation. All of our historical information we are able to gather demonstrates over and over and over again how our leaders came together over and over and over again into councils. They came into councils with the elders, they came into councils with the chiefs. And it's that collective that then had the ability to discuss and decide how are we going to approach signing treaties. And at the very end of 1760-61, we start to have what we call the Governor's Farm Ceremony. And that is a sign of where a lot of our leaders come together and act as a collective. They come together and realize we're going to have the burying of the hatchet ceremony. We're going to make peace and with the British once and for all. And then the beginning of the treaty ceremonies in 1725-26 in Annapolis Royal, again, you see the majority of the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot all coming together to say, yes, we have to enter into a relationship with the British. So it's through those actions, both at the beginning and the end of the treaty negotiations, the earliest signing and the latest signing, where you see this common collective movement. And for our people, that was the collective nation acting together to sign and bind our people into the treaties. It's also important to remember that a part of the political world for Mi'kmaq was that even though we were a collective, we had summer and winter villages, we came together in council, we decided how we would divide our lands, who would hunt where, who would live where. We also recognized that decision making, although it was made collectively, there was the ability for local communities to have to make decisions to the best of their ability as it affected them in that area. So I don't think there was never a time where you were bound and you couldn't do something. You were encouraged. Consensus was always key. People dialogued and shared and acted as a consensus. But at the end of the day, sometimes decisions had to be made that affected a local community without being able to engage in a bigger collective. So I think there was an understanding that, if a winter village was a small winter village and they had to act on their behalf without the necessity of, or the ability to have that bigger collective until summer or until weather allowed it, then they would. But that's the thing about Mi'kmaq political world, is that, Mi'kmaq is a derivative of Nigma. Nigma is family. Nigma is kin relations, and that's what we all were as one. We were all kin relations. And even when you look at the treaty signings, when you analyze the historical events that are occurring, you see chiefs attending weddings of daughters of the other chief, and they're married into families, and then they're coming in and signing the treaties together. And so you know that through that Nigaman kin relations between communities, people were bound and coming together and acting as one. Consultation is a word that is being heard more and more on the news, in the communities. People are becoming very familiar with the idea of consultation, and that government has an obligation to consult with our people and our leadership whenever it's going to do an act that may affect our Aboriginal and treaty rights. The Supreme Court has weighed in many times about what consultation means, and government seems to think it means they can pick up a phone and call and schedule a meeting and give us a chance to maybe say our concerns, and that's the end of it. They don't really have to implement those concerns, and off they go. Whereas we're sitting there saying, no, consultation is more than just a phone call. It's meaningful consultation. It means that government has to sit down and have every intention of listening to our concerns, and every intention of taking those concerns seriously and implementing them in a way that has the ability to least affect our Aboriginal and treaty rights. And so the Supreme Court has weighed in on that, and has given a bit of definition to it, and saying, clearly that consultation is more than just a phone call. There has to be an intention to protect or reconcile Aboriginal and treaty rights with whatever activity is going on. But I think as well, our treaties themselves also lend an interpretation to the issue of consultation. Because when you look at the terms of the treaties, we have in there an agreement with the Crown on various issues, an agreement for the protection of our rights. We have in there issues about consent, and about the idea that lands will not be settled without our consent. So those concepts show that even in the 1700s, our Indigenous leaders realized that you cannot affect us without our consent. You cannot affect us in a way that's going to hurt us. We have an agreement there. And so if we rely on the terms of the treaty to help us, we can see that it contributes to consultation. The treaties contribute to consultation because the treaties are basically saying these rights are protected. And if you're going to do anything in consideration of what the Supreme Court has said on consultation, you cannot continue to erode Aboriginal and treaty rights just on your own without any consideration for First Nations rights. And I think if we look to the treaties and rely on the treaties over and over again, even on issues of consultation, it provides a supporting lens and documentation. The other issue, I think, as well, is we're constantly hearing about reconciliation. And what does reconciliation mean? Well, reconciliation, everyone thinks it's sort of a new term, but in fact the treaties in a way are reconciliation, because they're reconciling our lands, our rights, our Indigenous way of life with newcomers coming here. So in many ways the treaties are reconciling how the newcomers would occupy our lands and how they would live here. And how we were going to reconcile each other's activities in a peaceful manner. So I think reconciliation was already on the minds of our leaders, hundreds of years ago.